white. I'm sorry I'm male. I'm sorry I'm white. I'm sorry I'm male. I'm sorry I'm white. I'm sorry I'm male. Why? Why am I a monster?
I remember the shining sanguines.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
Mit Gebeten hat man sie gelockt. Die Araber bringen bereits im 7. Jahrhundert den Islam nach Afrika und mit ihm die Sklaverei. Denn wer kein Moslem werden will, wird als Sklave in die muslimische Welt verschleppt. 17 Millionen Schwarzafrikaner trifft dieses Schicksal. Die Geschichte dieses Menschenhandels ist in Afrika bis heute ein Tabu. Tidiane Ndiaye bricht das Schweigen. Der senegalesische Anthropologe fordert, die Sklaverei der Moslems endlich aufzuarbeiten. In seinem Buch »Der verschleierte Völkermord« beschreibt Ndiaye dieses wenig erforschte Kapitel der Geschichte.
Der muslimische Sklavenhandel war der längste in der Geschichte der Menschheit. Er währte 13 Jahrhunderte und hatte viel mehr Opfer als der Sklavenhandel nach Amerika, der 400 Jahre dauerte. Und das Traurigste daran ist, dass die meisten der Verschleppten unglücklicherweise keine Kinder bekommen konnten, weil sie kastriert wurden.
In die arabische Welt, in die Türkei, nach Persien und nach Indien werden die Schwarzafrikaner verschifft. Oder sie werden durch die Sahara nach Nordafrika getrieben. Viele sterben schon bei den Überfällen auf die Dörfer, viele an den Strapazen des Transports. Wer auf den Sklavenmärkten ankommt, wird kastriert. Laut Ndiaye überlebt nur einer von 5 diese gefährliche Operation. Die grausame Prozedur trifft alle, die Männer, die auf Plantagen oder im Bergbau schuften, ebenso wie die, die im Haushalt arbeiten oder die Harems bewachen. Diese Eunuchen findet man noch Anfang des 20. Jahrhunderts.
Die Araber und die Nordafrikaner waren Rassisten. Sie verachteten die Schwarzen. Deshalb wollten sie nicht, dass sie in ihren Ländern Kinder zeugten. Das erklärt, warum es dort heute keine starke schwarze Diaspora gibt wie in den USA, die eine Aufarbeitung dieser Geschichte fordert und eine Wiedergutmachung.
An die Sklaverei der Europäer wird auf der senegalesischen Insel Gorée erinnert. Hier wurden Tausende eingepfercht und nach Amerika verschifft. Solche Erinnerungsorte forderten Ndiaye auch für den brutalen Menschenhandel der Moslems. Der ist für ihn ein Völkermord, denn ein Volk von Kastrierten kann keine Nachkommen zeugen und stirbt zwangsläufig aus. Die Versklavung geschah übrigens im Namen Allahs.
Der Koran hat die Sklaverei niemals unterbunden. Im Gegenteil, es gibt viele Stellen im Koran, die die Versklavung von Nichtmuslimen empfehlen. Und im Gegensatz zur Ächtung der Sklaverei im Europa der Aufklärung gab es nie auch nur einen arabischen Intellektuellen, der sich je für die Sache der Schwarzen eingesetzt hat.
Im Sudan rufen die Araber schon im 7. Jahrhundert den Dschihad, den heiligen Krieg gegen die Schwarzen, aus. Noch heute werden hier Tausende von ihren eigenen Landsleuten versklavt. Viele Afrikaner beten in Moscheen, obwohl ihre Vorfahren im Namen des Islam geknechtet wurden. Über Jahrhunderte wurden afrikanische Könige gezwungen, sich dem Islam zu unterwerfen und noch dazu Sklaven als Schutzgeld auszuliefern.
Durch die Islamisierung wurden die afrikanischen Könige zu Mittätern. Wer sich dem Islam unterwarf, konnte der Versklavung theoretisch entgehen. Wer kein Moslem werden wollte, sollte gezielt gejagt werden. Das war der Grund für die Kollaboration und das entfachte viele Kriege zwischen den afrikanischen Völkern.
Die Europäer schauen bis ins frühe 20. Jahrhundert zu. Obwohl sie den Menschenhandel längst verboten haben, dulden ihn die Kolonialarmeen vor Ort. Ein Zentrum des schmutzigen Geschäfts ist die ostafrikanische Insel Sansibar. Hier landen die Menschen nach dem Verbot der Sklaverei in unterirdischen Verliesen. Den berüchtigten Tipu-Tip macht der Menschenhandel zum zweitreichsten Mann Sansibars. Noch nach 1920 schuften Sklaven auf den Plantagen der Insel. 13 Jahrhunderte Sklaverei aufarbeiten, dafür gibt es offenbar weder in Afrika noch in der islamischen Welt Bereitschaft.
Es gibt eine Solidarität zwischen den Afrikanern und den Arabern wegen der gemeinsamen Religion, dem Islam. Man zieht es vor, über diese schmerzhafte Geschichte nicht zu sprechen. Man richtet die Aufmerksamkeit lieber auf die Schuldigen, die alle schon kennen, die Europäer und die Amerikaner.
Tidiane Ndiaye will das nicht hinnehmen. Weder als Intellektueller noch als Enkel eines senegalesischen Königs. Und auch nicht als Moslem.
Sun, the frozen forests and fallen leaves, and the hollow hill under the sky. I remember the complex gold caverns, the long tranquil tunnels, and the large underground lakes. I remember the dim depth of the earth, the lucid lady in the light, and her sacred stance. I remember the bright beast in her bow, the tall troll telling her tales, and the honey in the haunted hollow. I remember the protected password, the secret soothing symbol, and the oh thou object. I remember the red runes on the rock, the spell of seeing being sung, and the bold opening up of the beautiful burrow. I remember the coming of man reborn, the birth of Bantu the bride, the return of a world that was woefully lost.
Hello, this is David Duke. Other than war, no institution of recorded history has violated more human rights, caused more deaths, more suffering than that of slavery. Although slavery still exists in parts of Africa and other parts of the world, the last great trafficking in human slaves occurred in bringing Africans to the New World beginning in the early 16th century and flourishing up to the middle years of the 19th century. The most egregious, cruel, and murderous aspect of this period was the transatlantic slave trade, often called the Middle Passage. Scholarly studies of the loss of life during the transportation of slaves to the Americas suggest that between 7 and 10 million Africans suffered indescribable cruelty and perished in the Middle Passage. The human suffering and death from the African slave trade is the cornerstone of white guilt, both in America and around the world, and has been tirelessly promoted by both academic and popular media. The film Amistad by Steven Spielberg is the cinematic standard of films about the slave trade, and a more recent treatment is the excellent film called Amazing Grace. Amistad carefully portrays the slave trade as a Christian European-American enterprise. It is terribly unflattering portrayals of American leaders, the Queen of Spain, and conspicuously Christian slave traders. It has numerous images of Christian crosses accompanied by scenes of horrific treatment of black slaves. Before Amistad, though, in 1992, the Nation of Islam caused a tremendous controversy when it published the book The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. It quoted prominent Jewish historians who claimed that the African slave trade, and indeed slavery in the West, for the last 2,000 years, was thoroughly dominated by the Jewish community. Now, 15 years before the publication, I appeared on the largest black talk show in America and for the first time exposed the issue before a national audience. As strange as it might seem to some of you, in spite of my politics, I had a role in setting in motion the rising black awareness on this issue. 5 years after The Secret Relationship was published, Amistad was made. I think it was perhaps a remedial effort to put the genie back in the bottle. It was set in a thoroughly Christian New England. The actual center of the American slave trade was at Newport, Rhode Island. It is no minor coincidence that Newport had America's oldest synagogue and was home of the largest thriving Jewish community in the New World. Although Spielberg portrayed the horrific slave trade as thoroughly a Christian affair, here are some words of the major Jewish history of the early Americas called New World Jewry. It's by S.B. Liebman and the American Jewish Historical Society. He wrote about those who owned and manned the ships, the perpetrators of this mass human cruelty and murder. Quote, "They came with ships carrying African blacks to be sold as slaves. The traffic in slaves was a royal monopoly, and the Jews were often appointed as agents for the crown in their sale. They, the Jews, were the largest ship chandlers in the entire Caribbean region, where the shipping business was mainly a Jewish enterprise. The ships were not only owned by Jews, but were manned by Jewish crews and sailed under the command of Jewish captains." Now here's how I came to discuss the Jewish slave trade on Black Perspectives in the News on PBS. In the late 60s, I became acquainted with a slave trade researcher by the name of Walter White. He wrote a short booklet called Who Brought the Slaves to America? I contacted him and began doing my own research into the slave trade. I've read all the official Jewish histories pertaining to it. I've followed the issue for over 25 years now, scanning official Jewish general histories on the subject, and often those histories were published by Jewish historical societies and groups. These were histories written by Jews for Jews, and here's some direct quotes from the leading Jewish historians writing about the African slave trade. Now remember, you can find all the academic citations in my books, My Awakening and Jewish Supremacism. Prominent Jewish historian Mark Raphael, in his book Jews and Judaism in the United States, a documentary history, wrote, quote, "Jewish merchants played a major role in the slave trade. In fact, in all the American colonies, whether French, Martinique, British, or Dutch, Jewish merchants frequently dominated. This was no less true on the North American mainland. where during the 18th century Jews participated in the triangular trade that brought slaves from Africa to the West Indies and there exchanged them for molasses, which in turn was taken to New England and converted into rum for sale in Africa. Isaac da Costa of Charleston in the 1750s, David Franks of Philadelphia in the 1760s, and Aaron Lopez of Newport in the late 1760s and early 1770s dominated Jewish slave trading on the American continent. Jewish historians record old Jewish documents showing how the slave trade was so thoroughly Jewish that slave auctions throughout the Americas had to close on Jewish holidays. Brazil received far more African slaves than North America. A. Witzner, another official of the Jewish Historical Society, in his book Jews in Colonial Brazil, pages 72 and 73, wrote, quote, "The buyers who appeared at the auctions were almost always Jews, and because of their lack of competitors, they could buy slaves at low prices. If it happened that the date of such an auction fell on a Jewish holiday, the auction had to be postponed." Studying the Jewish histories of the New World, I began to learn of a carefully recorded Jewish history that you and I are not permitted to know about. I discovered that many centuries before the transatlantic slave trade, that Jews had dominated the slave trade in the entire Western world for the last 2,000 years, even as far back as Roman times. Duncan Wagnall's Jewish Encyclopedia, in Volume 10, page 48, writes, quote, "The trade in slavery constituted the main source of livelihood for the Roman Jews." To show you how widespread the Jewish slave trade was and how influential Jews seduced authorities centuries ago, just as they do in modern America and around the world, in the 5th century, Pope Gelasius permitted Jews to introduce slaves from Gaul into Italy on the condition that they were non-Christian. In the 8th century, Charlemagne explicitly allowed the Jews to act as intermediaries in the slave trade. In A History of the Jews from Babylonian Exile to the End of World War II, published by the Jewish Publication Society of America, the author writes, quote, "The Jews were among the most important slave dealers in European society." And here's a quote from the famous Jewish historian Jacob Marcus in the Encyclopedia Britannica. He matter-of-factly talks about the Jewish control of commerce in the Middle Ages. Quote, "In the Dark Ages, the commerce of Western Europe was largely in his hand, in particular, the slave trade. Not only were Jews the principal slave traders, they had markedly higher per capita holdings of slaves than did non-Jews." Jacob Marcus wrote in the United States Jewry, 1776-1985, page 586, quote, "All through the 18th century into the early 19th, Jews in the North were to own black servants. In 1820, over 75% of the Jewish families in Charleston, Richmond, and Savannah owned slaves. Almost 40% of all Jewish householders in the United States owned one slave or more." The actual fact is that even in the South, less than 5% of white people owned slaves. Less than 2% of whites owned slaves in all of pre-Civil War America, while 40% of Jewish householders owned slaves. Now notice how only guilt is ascribed for white people in slavery, even though Jews were 2,000% more likely to own black slaves than was any white Gentile person. When I broached some of these facts on black perspectives in the news, the host was fascinated. And the underlying question is why there is a collective white guilt assigned for the slave trade, but no collective Jewish guilt. Why are black Americans or white Americans not allowed to know who the primary slave traders were? The Anti-Defamation League and other Jewish organizations discovered that I documented the dominant Jewish role in the American slave trade, and they were desperate to prevent this historical truth from reaching a wide audience. Jewish leaders, Saul Rosen, Harry Bass, Peter Munchik, filed an injunction in the Common Pleas Court in Philadelphia asking the judge to block the program. The Jewish judge, Stanley Greenberg, then ordered that the program not be aired unless he approved it. I will never forget when, as a young boy, I watched a thoroughly Jewish movie called The 10 Commandments, starring the handsome Gentile icon Charlton Heston playing Moses. Now Moses stands up and condemns the Pharaoh for slavery. Here's a quick clip.
"It would take more than a man to lead the slaves from bondage. It would take a god. But if I could free them, I would.
What has turned you against me? What evil has done this to you?
The evil that men should turn their brothers into beasts of burden, to slave and suffer in dumb anguish, to be stripped of spirit and hope and faith only because they are of another race, another creed.
While Jewish Hollywood portrayed the Jews as fighting against the concept of human slavery and for freedom and human dignity, it just didn't happen to mention the fact that the Hebrews, while still in Egypt, according to the book of Exodus, had slaves too. Now here's a quote from Leviticus in the Old Testament showing the true Jewish view on slavery, proclaiming that Gentile slaves must be a Jewish inheritance forever and that it's permitted to treat them cruelly, but never to treat Jews in such harsh ways. As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are round about you. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your own brethren, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another with harshness. For simply quoting that verse from the Bible, my friend Sam Francis lost his job as an editorial writer in the Washington Times. Thank God that with the coming of Jesus, the Word of God, at least for Christians, became one of love and kindness. Only problem is that organized Jewry rejected and hated Jesus and the love and reconciliation that he taught. The practice and the edicts of Leviticus continued on down through the years until the slave trade was outlawed by Europeans in the 19th century. Newsweek and Time did stories about the Amistad movie, and matter-of-factly stated that myths about Jewish control of the slave trade are simply just that, an anti-Semitic canard. Unfortunately, most of Newsweek's readers were not told what prominent Jewish historians themselves wrote about the matter before it became an embarrassing issue. Ironic, isn't it? Before it became a shameful issue, Jewish historians were bragging of their control of the lucrative slave trade in their own histories for their own people. But when it became an embarrassment, after people like me exposed it, now they say, oh, this is just anti-Semitism. While whites are immersed in collective guilt for black slavery by the Jewish-controlled media, that same media parcels out not one iota of collective Jewish guilt for the horrific transatlantic slave. It's also important to note that slavery existed on the African continent from the beginning of time. It is true that many whites, as well as many African blacks, engaged in the slave trade, and that's a scar on the history of both our peoples. But it's also true that it was the European people themselves who ended not only the slavery and slave trade of blacks by whites and Jews, but also stopped most of the slavery existing among African blacks. The British and American Gentiles who courageously fought to end slavery and the slave trade, they had to go against Jewish financial power and political influence, which fought tooth and nail to preserve the nefarious enterprise in human flesh and suffering. It should be a badge of honor on Europeans in both England and America that they moved to outlaw the slave trade in spite of Jewish pressure and power. Blacks suffered for almost 300 years of Jewish-dominated slave trading, and tens of millions of European whites and others have suffered greatly for at least 2,000 years. The Jewish-dominated media from Hollywood to New York continue to wash the nation and the world with white guilt for slavery, while washing away any collective guilt of the people who hold the world's records for the slave trade since at least the time of the Romans. Now, why do they seek to instill guilt in our people, you might ask? The answer is clearly that the Jewish tribe sought to replace the ruling class of America and other European nations with their own people, and they understood that anything they could do to introduce guilt or shame upon their enemies, anything that would lessen their enemies' sense of loyalty and love of their own heritage, would weaken their resistance to Jewish power. And of course, the Jewish supremacists, they succeeded in replacing the old ruling class. They are the new ruling class of America, of Britain, of France, and Europe. Through their Fed and World Bank and IMF and globalist media and their political bribery in groups such as AIPAC and others, they've become more powerful than their wildest dreams. European peoples engaged in slavery, as have all other peoples on earth, but we should understand that at times tens of millions of our own became victimized by slavery. But Europeans are saddled by the Jewish media and unique guilt and self-hate for slavery, when the truth is that Europeans, at least, not only acted to end slavery in their own nations, but fought to eradicate it all over the earth. In sharp contrast to this, the people who have been the biggest champions of this repugnant trade in human suffering for the last 2,000 years, and who have fought tooth and nail to preserve it, don't have a trace of guilt. Not a trace of guilt is permitted. But times have changed. You've experienced only the tip of the iceberg of the Jewish domination of many kinds of human exploitation. I could talk about the modern white slave trade and millions of Eastern European women enslaved by these people, and it's by the same old tribal malevolence. So you see, it's not just the Palestinians who face the evils of Jewish supremacism. I talk about these issues not because I hate or want to harm Jews. I oppose human exploitation or suppression or hatred against anyone. Among the Jewish people, there are decent people, and it's time for them to end this hypocrisy, to clean up their act. Too long has the Jewish establishment of power sheltered and facilitated the worst violators of human exploitation. Modern Israel is the modern expression of the types of human oppressions and exploitation, torture, murder, and ethnic cleansing practiced in their history of the slave trade. Unfortunately, only a few courageous Jews like Gilad Atzmon and Israel Shamir fight this power, and I salute them. And I thank you. People often ask me, how can we change things? These are incredible facts. Now, what do we do about it? And what we do about it is spread this truth, change the consensus, defend our heritage, and to fight for justice for our own people and for all people. That's what we do about it. One person at a time. Spread this video, spread the truth, tell the truth, be courageous, and we will change the world.